From having worked as an investigator in the domestic and family violence, child protection and sex crime space, I have seen the results of inaction, of a lack of interdepartmental communication, and it is horrific. I won't talk about those in this place, but I will use a couple of stories to highlight why the legislation the Minister is proposing is so important and why it needs to be implemented with the utmost haste. The first story I'll tell you is about a family in our community of Palmerston. A family that feels they're not being heard, and whilst I appreciate I may draw the ire of some, it needs to be said. My first point would be to acknowledge the exceptional courage of this family in speaking with me, and then agreeing to this speech being delivered in this place, so that it is heard by all members of the Assembly, and I hope desperately that we choose to listen. For the sake of protecting their identities, I'll use a pseudonym. The last thing they need is more stress on top of what they have already endured. And I'll also speak to some of this in the hypothetical, but nonetheless, they have read this speech and confirmed it says what they believe needs to be said in this place. John, Michelle and their children are a local family. They're Territorians and committed to the Territory and Palmerston. They live here, work here, have their friends here and raise their family here. They are the embodiment of people that are an asset to our community. They pay their mortgage and have their own little piece of the territory to call home. They pay their taxes, support local business, and they do everything they can to be upstanding members of our community. Unfortunately, life is a journey, and sometimes you hit a bump in the road. I wish everything was as rosy as people's social media feeds try and make it, but unfortunately, as all of us who don't live in a political bubble already know, life is messy. We each try and make our way through the journey as best we can, but most of us will acknowledge we make mistakes, we're not all perfect, certainly not by a long shot. Now, John and Michelle told me that they first noticed things were going awry at school. They noticed, as parents do, that their eldest son, David, had started hanging around with a new group of friends. As a long-term Territory family, they had concerns. They knew that this group were getting involved in crime and had been through the youth justice system. They frequently didn't attend school and were fitted with ankle trackers when they were not apparently in custody. John and Michelle contacted the school. They'd noticed the behavioural changes in David. The school told them he wasn't attending, his grades had slipped, and his behaviour at school was worsening. They asked the school what could be done to help. Apparently the school advised that they couldn't assist. His behaviour wasn't bad enough for intervention, but they suggested that John and Michelle contacted Territory families. As parents concerned for their son, this is exactly what they did. They tell me that they received the same advice. It was at this stage their problem to manage as parents, and David's behaviour was not sufficiently serious enough to warrant intervention. Now, I pick up on the member for Gwodge's comments. He's right. The team at Territory Families are incredible. It's because they care. It's one of those jobs you do as a vocation because it's a calling. I know so many people who work in Territory Families personally from my previous role. They're my friends and I'm constantly in awe of what they do. I know they just want to be able to do more. And I know every one of them would want families like John and Michelle's to prosper. And this isn't criticism in any way, shape or form. It's feedback from a family that care deeply about the Territory and want to be able to help. This has apparently gone on for about 12 months. David's behaviour was of increasing concern to them. They suspected he was involved in substance misuse, and then came the shock. They saw CCTV footage of David with his friends out in the early hours of the morning wandering the streets. Upon learning that David had been involved in allegedly criminal behaviour, they did what any responsible parents would do. They counselled him and took him to the Palmerston police station to hand himself in. And what they report next is what fills me with concern and is exactly the opposite of what I understand our intent to be. They advised that as far as they were aware, there was no record of interview, and at no point did they see anybody indicate that David had done anything wrong, despite allegedly committing an offence of unlawful entry contrary to Section 213 of the Criminal Code Act, aggravated by clauses 4 and 5, which carries a maximum penalty upon conviction of 20 years imprisonment. They advised that they found the experience was completely transactional and not in any way, shape or form transformative. They likened it to going to the supermarket. Apparently David was taken in, had his fingerprints, photographs and DNA taken, and was advised that juvenile diversion would be in contact with him in a month or so because there were delays. He was then released. As far as David and his family were aware to freedom, and their words were that they felt it was without consequence. We know that in the case of alleged youth offenders that justice delayed is justice denied, which appears on the information provided to be what they feel has occurred. I spoke to Michelle last week when I wrote to the relevant minister's offices to notify them of this, and both John and Michelle up until this morning advised they still have had no contact from juvenile diversion, not even sorry we're busy. But they don't know if he slipped through the cracks or if there are processes ongoing, despite it being months since the initial contact. Now, when John and Michelle contacted me a couple of months ago, they advised me they'd contacted the Office of the Minister for Police. They'd spoken with advisors and told me they'd been promised a follow-up. As parents, they understood, as is backed up by an exorbitant amount of evidence, which we've spoken about in this place and none more than the relevant ministers, that without consequences there's an increased risk of David being emboldened, an elevation of criminal behaviour and risk factors that we're all too well aware of. But instead of the promised action, John and Michelle report no action whatsoever, and as foreseen, their worst fears materialised. David's behaviour escalated, the offending continued, and he was on the run after having allegedly committed other offences in our community. He was apparently arrested at a friend's house, taken into custody, and they still don't know what happened to him. They don't know where he's staying apart from the friend's house, if he's continuing to misuse substances, or if he's committing further offences. They report police will contact when they're looking for him, but there's been nothing proactive and nothing that seems indicative of an attempt to ameliorate his behaviour or support them as parents. John and Michelle both feel that his most recent arrest again may have been a transactional interaction. He may have been out again that very night. And his parents are beside themselves with grief at what to do next, and I wholeheartedly empathise with his parents. I can hear the pain in their voices every time I talk with them, which has been daily. There is literally nothing else that Michelle and John could have done. They report that every government department so far has not been able to aid them. When David's behaviour has escalated to the point the system deemed it to be serious enough, they feel they've fallen into a rote transactional response that appears indicative of a system that doesn't know what to do with young people that are put in the too hard basket. While I appreciate our friends in opposition will be jumping for joy at a chance to kick the government over what might be a lack of response, John told me that they were just as bad. He advised me he attempted to contact the leader of the opposition when he emailed the minister's office and experienced similar disinterest, with a response noting the information may inform a response to government. His overall feeling was that our friends opposite were only interested in using their all too real and emotional experience for political gain, a bizarre form of crime voyeurism where the humanity is lost in the ever-incessant quest for political point scoring. John, Michelle and their family have been here for years. They have seen governments of both persuasions come and go, and I'm personally exceptionally grateful that they trusted me enough to be their voice in the Legislative Assembly. But it is all too easy to see why our community can be disenfranchised with their political representatives. They're our friends, neighbours and community. Their children, as the member for Roger rightly said, will be the next group of leaders in the territory. They deserve better than being used as political footballs. And before anybody gets too angry with me, the difference between the Territory Labor government and country Liberal opposition is that I know the Minister for Police and most certainly the Minister for Territory Families do care deeply about this. John and Michelle are happy to meet with any parliamentarian or chief executive and walk them through their journey from the beginning to where they find themselves now. They want to help. They're a hard-working family who are the backbone of the territory, and they're our people. They're a valued part of the Palmerston community and an asset to the territory. They're not here from interstate for a quick stint before going home. They're committed Territorians, and they want the territory to be the best it can be for all of us. I think testament to their community spirit is that whilst they desperately want positive intervention and assistance for their son, they also want to ensure that no other parents have to experience what they have. And I would imagine, should you ask, that even David may be willing to talk given the opportunity and should it present itself. I cannot imagine there would be a more relevant story to hear. Given that I know the Minister for Police and Minister for Territory Families have personally worked on the policies, legislation and strategic direction to ensure the experience of this poor family does not happen, I plead that we use David's lived experience of the system as a case study to find out what is going wrong, why our strategic intent appears to have been found wanting, and what can we do to rectify it. Why didn't Strike Force Orion or Territory Families engage? If that's the case, what happened at the school? Do we need to mandate trauma-informed practice? Is it a case of insufficient resources for Orion? Are the teams at Orion finding a barrier to information sharing? And as the Minister said, this bill proposes to fix that. Is it a case of resourcing or communication issues within Territory Families, or do we need an operational level version of the Territory Intelligence Coordination Centre or its renamed successor? When I look at the timeline of where intervention could and should have occurred, it would have started at school when David's parents tried to speak with them. Apparently there was no school-based constable to engage with, and the school seemed to accept it as a fait accompli. There was no understanding, and it apparently left David in a learned helplessness, hanging around with a group that got punished, where he got punished no matter if he engaged in the behaviour or not. Punishments were apparently transactional and reinforced the negative behaviour. We're talking really basic principles of adolescent psychology from my understanding, if what I've been told is correct, and the solutions are not complicated. It requires trauma-informed practice, training, and teachers coming to this territory from interstate need to be aware of the unique issues we have up here, which are complicated. Talking to Strike Force Orion, it's a fantastic initiative. I've written to the ministers and would like it recorded on the Hansard that Detective Constable Brad Lush and Senior Constable Tanya Hogan are an incredible asset to the territory and the Territory Police. Their proactive and passionate approach to policing appears to be a roaring success, and I look forward to seeing how both Brad and Tanya are able to make further positive strides into this excellent example of community policing from the Territory Labor Government. It showcases the change that police officers working in conjunction with their interdepartmental colleagues and information sharing with each other can make in our community when it works. Young people who do the wrong thing must have consequences. We know that, for all the right reasons. Northern Territory government agencies must work together to prevent harm to the community and support victims while working with at-risk young people through prevention and diversion programs. When Strike Force Orion was launched, its aims were to deliver a coordinated and high-level structure comprising NT Police, Territory Families, Housing, Education, Department of Chief Minister of Health, to deliver a sustainable plan focusing on the response and management for high-risk youth offenders, to deliver proactive engagement prevention plans to reduce the likelihood of further offending, to be intelligence-driven, utilising current data holdings across agencies, to formulate joint case management and intervention plans for high-risk youth and their families, to map recent offending, to focus resources on prevention activity, community engagement and reassurance to the community, to focus on intervention strategies to reduce the impact of alcohol and domestic violence within the family home, which would be nothing more important, to engage with stakeholders to get traction on social service, youth-funded programs to assist in breaking the cycle of offending, which we're certainly doing, and to leverage off Neighbourhood Watch, Victims of Crime NT, Biz Secure and Alcohol Secure to promote prevention and education, providing high visibility policing to reduce antisocial behaviour and crime. Strike Force Orion was to be responsible to the Children and Families Subcommittee within the Operations Centre established at the former Palmerston Police Station, I believe to facilitate co-location and coordination of government service. So the question has to be asked why Orion didn't get involved with David. I know it wouldn't have been for the lack of engagement by Brad and Tanya. They go above and beyond every single day they're on duty. Are they swamped? Do we need more police in Orion? Do we need more liaison with departments? Are there proper communication lines? Or are people struggling to get information from other agencies? I don't know. I asked the Minister's Office for a visit to Orion to try and find out about a year ago, but police were unable to facilitate it. But perhaps if we look at David's case, it will yield some answers. I have no doubt that were Orion aware, and if they did have the resources to ameliorate the offending, I wouldn't be delivering this speech now. But it appears the opportunities for intervention in this case didn't stop there. John and Michelle say they tried multiple times to engage with different departments and were banging their head against a brick wall that his behaviour wasn't serious enough. They asked for support, they asked for what options were available, but kept getting advised that there wasn't anything. And it further begs the question, at what stage would the youth outreach and re-engagement officers get involved? Again, this is another excellent programme by the Territory Labor Government to disrupt the cycle of crime, and it's working. But what went wrong in this case? In December 2019, when the Territory Labor Government established the new youth outreach and re-engagement teams, the Yorra Hub in the Palmerston CBD at my old workplace, the Palmerston Police Station, we noted that it would provide voluntary and court-ordered case management services to young people aged 10 to 17 who are already at risk of entering or have already entered the youth justice system. The old police station was large enough that other relevant service providers could use the space to deliver their services, and that the youth outreach and re-engagement officers in the team, the Orios, were to work with young people and their families to prevent young people from offending or re-offending. The Orios have been brilliant. The activities and programs delivered at the facility include tackling antisocial behaviour, role modelling, gender respect and understanding. The OREOs also reconnect young people to education and training, counselling and medical services so that they can get back on the right track. And the YORIT was part of a number of early intervention and prevention programs and services that the Territory Labor government introduced to try and prevent crime before it happens. Overwhelmingly, it's a success. At the time, my fellow Palmerstonian, the Honourable Member for Drysdale, noted that the Territory Labor government's creating safer communities by investing in youth services that will reduce crime and antisocial behaviour. That's what the Territory Labor government's about. The OREOs are specialist youth workers. They work to prevent young people from entering the youth justice system, but also prevent young people from re-offending, which is unlike our friends opposite, who slash youth services when they were in government and would do it again if they got the chance. The former member for Brennan also sagely noted that the Territory Labor government was investing in the people of Palmerston. The new Palmerston YORIT hub giving at-risk young people a place to go to get specialist help that will address antisocial and criminal behaviour. And this was in addition to the Palmerston Youth Dropping Centre, another roaring success, which will engage all young people in structured activities and kept them off the street at night. So what went wrong with David? His parents report they knew about the facilities, knew about the media releases and thought they had a chance for intervention. What happened? Why didn't it swing into action? What went wrong and how did we miss this chance for David and his family? Was it down to simple interdepartmental communication, and this bill will fix that issue? Or as I suspect, was it something more systemic that needs a deeper dive into David's journey to see what the missed opportunities were and how we make sure they don't happen again? Anecdotally, and speaking on a condition of anonymity for fear of repercussions, I spoke with an adult who had taken a young person into the YORIT hub. They said they'd been contacted to facilitate a conversation so that a file could be closed. When they took the young person in, the young person introduced himself to the YORIT worker and asked the adult if they'd met before. The young person advised that they hadn't, although the YORIT had been assigned to the young person for 7 months. They'd not spoken, which seems at odds with what our intention is, and perhaps going some way to explaining the issue with David, but I can only puzzle on it and continue raising it. Thanks to the loving and caring family that David has, we as the Territory Labor government are presented with a unique opportunity to learn lessons, respond to them and implement measures to correct any issues found. It would seem a tragedy both for David, his family and future generations of Territorians should we not take this opportunity, and I again congratulate them on their personal strength to bring this into the light as the parents of an alleged offender. The hurt they are feeling is raw, and anything we can do should be done for the victims, for them, for future generations of Territorians and for David as well. Something happened to cause this, we don't know what, but we need to find out. The second story I'd like to talk about is along similar lines, unfortunately. I have a stream of people coming into my office bemoaning the lack of communication, and this is where it makes no sense. The NTG domestic violence policy is gold standard. I've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb, and the practice guides, legislation, risk management framework is everything it should be and more. For some reason, though, it doesn't seem to reflect the reality of what women are going through at the moment. And firstly, I'll use a reality of a victim of domestic and sexual violence. For example, the hard-working frontline members of the Northern Territory Police Force were called by the neighbours to screaming and shouting at a house in the Palmerston area. The victim's survivor, Jane, has been beaten up and assaulted sexually by her partner. They attend, they immediately swing into action and arrest the alleged offender and start the process for a full non-contact DVO, utilising the provisions of Section 41 of the DV Act. The offender is conveyed to the watch house where he awaits a forensic procedure and offer of an electronic record of interview. He was under the influence of amphetamine or alcohol, so will need to come down before that can occur, but the victim, beaten, bloody and bruised and in a state of massive psychological trauma, will dress herself after the assault. There's no ambulances available, so she may end up sat in the rear of a police vehicle and conveyed to the Royal Darwin Hospital, where she needs to go prior to the Sexual Assault Referral Centre. For the sake of argument, it can be about 10 p.m. on a Friday night. She waits in the cacophony of an emergency department in full swing, and still sitting there in the clothes she dressed herself in post-assault, perhaps for hours. She'll be seen by doctors. The doctors will treat her initial medical injuries and complete an early evidence kit of forensic swabs. But the victim will still be sitting there post-assault, waiting for the x-rays and medical clearance. When the victim's survivor will get released, it will maybe about 5 a.m. Back to the night shift general duties guys who convey her to the Sexual Assault Referral Centre, often still in the same clothes and still bloodied and bruised. If she's got kids, they'll have been looked after by a friend, but she doesn't know how much her daughter may have heard or saw and what psychological state she's in. On arrival at SARC, the absolutely incredible staff, and they are incredible, swing into action. Things get a bit more uncomfortable as the victim survivor consents to the invasive forensic procedures, but the staff are compassionate and excellent, and I've never worked with better. They do absolutely the best they can with what they have. They'll take the victim's clothing, seize it and replace it with the best they have at SARC. They'll try and care for her, clean her up and restore some of her dignity. But still some 10 hours post-assault as daylight creeps up the horizon, and at this stage the General Duties officers will say goodbye and knock off for the night. The domestic and family violence teams will have been notified and they'll be en route to SARC. They'll meet with Jane, who is sitting with coffee and being comforted by Prue and her team, and Jane is still worried about her daughter, who is tired and traumatised. The investigators from the DV section will arrive and take Jane next door to the interview room, termed the soft interview room. The room, if it is still the same, has the feelings of a late 90s charity shop. There are a few toys, a fridge, which doesn't usually have anything in it, as nobody has a Costco to stock it, and some instant coffee, tea and UHT milk if you're lucky. Jane, tired and traumatised, will then attempt to provide a cognitive interview to the investigators, an audio-visual interview with one officer sitting on the old uncomfortable sofa, whilst the other is in the room behind monitoring. They'll start with the legal questions and then ask Jane to explain in as much detail as possible what's happened. It can take hours. Jane hasn't slept. She's still worried about her daughter, bruised albeit somewhat less bloody. Her experience here is reliant on the skills of the interviewers and the time they have available to them, bearing in mind that they've still got a partner in custody. And last time I checked the NTG phone list, the DV section had about 6 investigators that could be deployed compared to the 20 in Strikeforce Trident. The DV unit will get an account and go to the watch house to process her partner, as well as dealing with any other ongoing investigations. During the existence of the investigation, they'll discover Jane's daughter and complete a mandatory referral to territory families. Jane, upset and traumatised with no home to go to, is now scared what will happen to her child. If space is available, Jane is taken to pick up her daughter by the investigators and then to one of the women's shelters, where again the incredible staff whose commitment to the cause is superhuman. They'll make it work on the limited resources they have, and then Jane will get to sit down, cry and try to process what's happened. At least Jane will have access to counselling, you think? Well, maybe. Waiting times, I've been told, of 5 months are not unusual at the moment, such as the backlog at SARC. Jane can try and find someone privately, but she has no money, nowhere to live, is tired, scared and doesn't know what is going to happen next. And as can happen, the original officers attending may not put a premises access order under Section 41. And because they didn't know about Jane's daughter, the Section 41 application may not have the child listed. So, Jane will try and go to DVLS to get it amended, the Domestic Violence Legal Service. Again, I run out of superlatives to describe the staff at both DVLS and the Top End Women's Legal Service who go above and beyond to make this as easy as possible. But Jane still needs to get from the safe house to the court to see DVLS. When she's arrived, she's told that they have a 4-week wait, so she tries Jules. Again, these wonderful staff will make overtime to make this work, but they're at capacity. Jane will be advised by police that her partner has been dealt with and what the outcome of that was, but she now faces the long trial of the family law process through the civil courts, in addition to trying to travel between the Darwin CBD, Casuarina, Royal Darwin Hospital, Palmerston and Berrima to speak to all the different agencies to try and get access to services. At some stage, territory families will want to talk to Jane to discuss her daughter. Jane's still traumatised, still has no counselling, potentially, and another series of large decisions to make. Time will pass and there will be limited contact with different agencies, and Jane will try and rebuild her shattered life until the date of the court hearing. She may be called by the Director of Public Prosecutions for proofing, but there are, unless things have changed, 3 witness assistance officers and 2 coordinators. They don't have a vehicle, and Jane needs to take time off work and arrange childcare to go and see them. She can only get a lift from police if she's lucky and they have the time. It certainly isn't a guarantee. Then you have the horror of cross-examination. It's a speech for another day, but for all that we hold precious, we need to reform the legislation so that there are agreed questions decided between defence and prosecution in consultation with a presiding judicial officer, and spare these women the sharp tongue of her abuser's legal advocate as she relives the trauma that, if she's been lucky, she's only just started receiving counselling for. Madam Speaker, the legislation is a step in the right direction, but we have good laws, we have good policy. We have, as a government, done so much in this space where it was merely perfunctory before. We need to learn the lessons of what the reality is and have quality assurance and quality control process to ensure that our policies are doing what they're set out to achieve, and people like the ones in the stories I've just told receive the service that our government intends. I stridently support this bill and the work the Minister is doing in the space. She's incredible, and it will be transformative, but we need to be aware of where it can go wrong and take steps to ameliorate that. If I may, Madam Speaker, can I seek permission to table a document?
Is leave granted? Leave granted?
Thank you. This document is from the Victoria Auditor General's Office, and it was a review done to them in managing safety hubs. Now, these came about as a result of the Royal Commission into Domestic and Family Violence down in Victoria. So, thank you. And I think that we could learn a lot of lessons from them. The issues are the same, although the problems are different and require more work in the Northern Territory. But co-locating services will mean a huge amount for victims. It will mean that they're not traipsing around the Territory. And from the Victorian experience, not only did they co-locate in relation to domestic violence, but they co-located in relation to children as well. I urge you to read it. It finds that the department sort of rushed to implementation to meet timelines, but from a lay perspective, it appears that learning the lessons in the Territory, but if we implemented it with a strategic project management process and oversight from the Department Chief Minister, like we did with the Riley Review, could yield hugely positive results. Now, I appreciate this is a subject that I write regularly on, and I appreciate the angst it appears to generate from some in departments that I question the way it's always been done. And I further recognise that in my entire policing career and very, very short political one, I've never seen a Minister of the Crown more dedicated in this space than Minister Warden and her office team. Ministers, I've looked after the victims of domestic and family violence for years. I've watched their children grow, the cycle of abuse continue. I've donned my cap as a police negotiator as their mental health has declined, they've broken down and ended up in crisis negotiations, as unfortunately they've attempted to end their lives, and I've then watched as some of them have, either at the hands of their abusers or through self-medicating the unspeakable trauma through alcohol and drugs. My soul aches every time our office has to step in and try and pick up the pieces, and I've had this conversation with my constituents, most members of the Legislative Assembly and other elected members across the political spectrum, at all levels of government. My reason for entering politics was the overwhelming sense of frustration I had picking up the pieces of broken families for nearly 2 decades. And I beg you, please can we learn the lessons of our Victorians, our cousins across the ditch in New Zealand and the Nordic nations. We can do better, it doesn't cost a massive amount of money, and the savings will be self-evident. It costs so little to try and co-locate these already existing services and avoid the lessons already learned and documented by the aforementioned jurisdictions. These hubs need to have agencies located together. They need to have different culturally appropriate streams, and every day we lose to implementing this is another victim survivor, another broken child, another coroner's report to add to the litany peppering the annals of history throughout Australia. If you want a single example of how we can do better, please visit the soft interview room at SAR and see for yourself if I'm telling the truth, and whether you feel it's a therapeutic situation for a traumatised victim and how much it will take to improve it. If we can have
Point of order, Madam Speaker.
Please pause the member for Blaine.
Standing order 43, an extension of time for the member for Blaine.
Is it extension of time granted? An extension of time granted. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Member for Roger.
You're welcome.
If we can have a war on terror, a war on drugs, a battle footing on COVID-19 and a campaign on the road toll, let us please, for the love of God, have a war on domestic and personal violence. Thank you very much.